is more complex than Mint 1. All right. So here's an example of a real project. Uh, so in the first 2 weeks, so it's a new project, fresh code. So the team is very productive in the first 2 weeks, right? Um, every time some as soon as task is created in their issue tracker, it's closed right away. But after 2 weeks, the gap between opening tasks and closing tasks becomes longer and longer. It takes longer and longer to finish tasks. And that's because in just 2 weeks, it gets the code becomes more and more complex. All right. So in just 2 weeks, what was fresh project has started to become legacy already. And in several months, in just months, what was a new project has become legacy. All the problems dealing with legacy systems are there, right? The complexity of it, right? Economically, so how do you explain this to the business people, the managers? Economically, uh, a lot of managers, a lot of business people think that software development is just, oh, you do a project, you deliver the project, and that's the cost, this little hill over here. What they don't realize is as soon as you get it into the hands of users, the cost, it's the cost just begin to grow once it gets into the hands of users, and it grows in an exponential rate, right? So users want more features, your competition, you have to keep up with your competition, there's regulation, etc., etc. And because of all these changes you have to do to respond to the business needs, you end up having more and more complexity. And the cost of maintaining your code begins to grow very, very fast. It gets to the point that even if people still find the software useful and maybe you're earning revenue from the system, the development costs make it no longer economical to maintain the software. So the development costs, the maintenance costs exceed the the benefits from the software. So software gets too complex when we anticipate future requirements. Okay, so there's so many things that, especially business people, they think, oh, I need to come up with all my requirements up front, so I don't have to ask them again. They should be doing the opposite, just the things they're sure about, because you can always ask the software developers to build new stuff. But instead, they try to anticipate too many things, and that overcomplicates the requirements. Um, Uncertain or vague requirements. When a requirement is vague, what does the team do? They interpret, um, they try to interpret the requirement in in every scenario they can think of, right? And that again adds complexity. Something that could be read only, they'll make it read write or something like that. Enamored with Enamorment with technologies or approaches. Latest frameworks, unnecessary design patterns. So hey, this new framework came out, let's use that. Hey, we need machine learning, let's use TensorFlow. So um, yeah, so enamorment with technologies or approaches that adds to the complexity. You're using a technology or an approach just because you want to, and not because it had business value to the software. Unneeded flexibility is another, all right? So again, anything that can be read-only or hard-coded or unidirectional is a lot simpler than the opposite. So remember to practice YAGNI or DTS TTCPW. YAGNI means you ain't gonna need it. Uh, DTS TTCPW means do the simplest thing that could possibly work. Okay? Do the simplest that could possibly work. YAGNI means um, don't anticipate requirements for the future. Just work on things you're sure now, because future requirements will change and end up wasting people's time, and uh, you just add to the complexity, right? Um, Let me pause a bit. Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute, or you can just uh, post in the chat box. Any questions? So clear? Okay. All right. Let me go on. So no questions. Um, Now let's talk a little bit about test-driven development. Of course, one of the benefits is we end up having more tests. Uh, Tests are the best documentation because they don't lie. Unlike if you write even a comment, sometimes the comment, if you write your documentation as test, um, the test will always tell the truth or it will break, right? So you have to write to see your test not so much as uh, tests, but as documentation that you will leave for the next guy. So um, if we're trying to look at trying to learn something new, whether we're looking at documentation or we're going to Stack Overflow or whatever, what's the first thing we look at? It's not going through all the paragraphs. We look at the code examples first, and that's what tests are. They're basically code examples of um, how to use the code. All right, so they're very good documentation, and they should be written that way, very clear. You should think of yourself when you're writing tests uh, as leaving documentation for the next people who will maintain your code. Okay, tests help you design. Um, what tests do is you get to see your code from the point of view of someone who will be using your code. Um, so you start using your code even before you finished it. All right. Um, and then you see, oh, I realize I have too many parameters, or it's not so easy to use, or the name isn't so good, or it's too long, it's not intuitive. You get to see things, you get to learn about whether your code is easy to use or not. You only find that out when you start using it, okay? And tests help you do that, all right? And it also helps you discover scenarios that need clarification. You think you know it, then when you start writing a test, you realize you don't know it, and then you need to talk to someone who understands the requirement. It helps you be deliberate and focused. Like sometimes when I'm coding at home, my kid comes in and and disturbs me. I have to go off somewhere. And when I come back, I just look at the test that's failing. Then I can resume where I left off. So my goal is just to make that test work. So when you're doing TDD, you're not going off in multiple scenarios right away. You try to finish one small scenario at a time. All right. So if your boss calls you off the meeting quickly, when you get back, you're only working on one scenario, and whatever test is failing at the moment, that's what you focus. Uh, that's what you focus on fixing. All right. So TDD, test a little, code a little. There's a rhythm to it. You're not doing things in. You're not writing tests in one big sitting, and then trying to implement them in another. Um, you should be doing a few minutes of writing tests, a few minutes of getting them to work, and then going back to the test. All right. Um, 5 steps of TDD. Some people use other number of steps, but I I prefer 5. Uh, the first is to add a test, Again, you're not doing TDD all the time, but in cases where there is value in doing TDD, you add a test, you watch the test fail. Why do you think we have to watch the test fail? All right. Yeah, why do you think we have to watch the test fail? It's because that's how you test the test, right? If you don't watch your test fail, then maybe later on, and it's happened to me, hey, all my tests are passing, and I realize as I delete code to figure out where the bug is, even if I removed all my code, my tests are still passing.
Hi, calling.
Yes, I'm on a call.
What? But I'm not. You're not on a call, see?
Yeah, I'm on a call.
But
So,
why are you not using your phone then?
So your tests are so um, so the chance you have to test your test is before there's any code implemented yet. Uh, you have to run them and get them to fail first. Then you realize, okay, my test is actually
Daddy,
testing
why
something.
fail?
Then you write the code. Then then you run the test. If they're not yet passing, you tweak the code until you get the test to run, and then you refactor. So the end of it uh, is not getting your code to work. The end is when you've refactored your code. All right. So refactoring is leaving the campsite cleaner than you found it. All right. Because when every time we add new features, uh, code becomes more complex. You can't help it, and it's very hard to think about code quality when you're trying to get things to work. Um, but when you're so focus on getting things to work, and then once you get things to work and you have your test, making sure you don't break anything, that's when you refactor. It's very hard to do refactoring and implementing features. So first focus on making a feature work, and then you refactor. So refactoring is cleaning up your code in little bits, okay, as you are um, throughout your regular day. Okay, so two hats. When you're implementing, you're not refactoring. When you're refactoring, you're not implementing. Okay.
Where's my
My son wants to. You want to say hi? Come here. Come here. Come here. Come here. Hi. He doesn't believe that I'm on a call. Can everybody unmute and say hi to my son? Because he doesn't believe it.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Hi.
He's not on the call.
Do you not believe I'm on a call? All right. I'm working. I'm actually working.
Come on. Daddy's working. Okay. Where's my aircraft? Okay.
All right. So where was I? Any questions? Are there any questions? You can chat.
Calen, you're on mute.
Sir Calen, you're muted po. Sir, uh, nakamute po kayo.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes po.
All right. Thanks. All right. Sorry about that. Uh, so there's a question. Is TDD applicable for new projects? Oh, definitely. Uh, TDD, again, TDD is a practice of design and documentation. So yes, it is uh, applicable for new projects. Not every project, because if it's just simple CRUD, for example, you're just doing tracking data from web page to database without much complex logic, then you don't really need to practice TDD. Um, so yes, whether new or old, it's more about the level of complexity that you have in your code. So thanks for the question. Right? Any other questions? Um, so let me proceed with the presentation. Um, so the common misconception is we create domain models for persistence because what people think their first encounter with a domain model is using some sort of ORM like JPA, Hibernate, or .NET framework. But that's not the point of a domain model. All right. So domain models existed even before um, these ORMs existed, right? So a domain model, the point of the domain model is to make complex business logic maintainable, right? So it's basically, if you have complex business logic, the best way is to model your code after the domain. So you look at the domain, you try to make your code mirror or shadow, not really mirror, shadow the actual business as closely as possible, and that will help organize your code. All right. So this solves the number one problem that we have between developers and business people is that they don't understand each other. They speak different languages. Um, so of course they use different terms. Like I remember first time I was a project manager. Uh, I was listening half an hour to a banker, and I couldn't understand the word she said. And after 30 minutes for talking, I said, uh, "Ma'am, what's debit and credit?" And then she got so upset and flabbergasted because the simplest accounting term I didn't understand. And I'm sure she wouldn't understand what transaction means or vice or unidirectional versus bidirectional or whatever. So we speak very different, confusing languages, and we're unable to communicate. And so over time, team members get to understand the domain, right? But it's just in the heads of the team member. And at some point, when one team member leaves, that team member takes the domain knowledge away. So they say, "Hey, document it," but still the documentation, it's very difficult to document it accurately um, where a new person can be productive right away. Okay. So basically, what a domain model is in the words of Eric Evans, the creator of domain-driven design, he said, domain model is the ubiquitous language between the business and developers. All right. The business model is basically the entities and the relationships. Um, the most basic sense, of course, DDD is more complex than this, but in the most basic sense, you start with um, using the nouns and verbs of the business domain as the identifiers for your classes, methods, and variables. Okay, so as the names of your variables, methods, and classes, use the nouns and the verbs. So the benefit is your code ends up becoming documentation about the business and it retains the knowledge of the team. So even if you're a new guy, say you're new to the team, you're a fresh grad, you join the team, and then suddenly the business says, "Hey, there's a problem in billing. There's a bug in billing." You just have to do a find of all your code that says of the code that says billing. Do a find on your code, and if you properly documented uh, the business within your code, then somewhere in your search, you know that somewhere in your search will be the lines of code where the bug is happening. But if you don't create ubiquitous language, like instead of, if I remember, uh, there was uh, there was a team at my office creating a document approval system, and then I asked. So when I looked over the shoulder of one dev, I asked, "Hey, what does constraint mean?" "Oh, constraint is the number of approvers." "Why don't you just call it number of approvers so that people don't have to guess what constraint means?" Okay. So if there is a disconnect between the terms you use in your code versus the terms used in the business, it's very hard for new people in your team to know where everything is, especially when there's a bug that urgently needs to be fixed. But if you use uh, the terms of the business, then even the new people will have an idea where everything is in the code. Okay. Um, a domain model will never allow an object, a good domain model will never allow an object to be in an invalid state. All right. Um, so we all know that we need to make our class members and our object members as private as possible. Um, as much as possible, only the object itself can access those members if that's possible. Favor immutability. If you can make a field final, or if you're not sure whether a field should be final or immutable, make it final, because something that is read only is simpler than something that is read write. So if you realize later on, oh, I made a mistake, I need to make it uh, writable, then you just delete the final and suddenly the field is writable already. But or add a setter. But uh, if you already added that setter and made it, you didn't add final to the field, um, and it's already been in production. The field is being modified, and then we realize it was a mistake. It's causing bugs or it's causing complexity, making it hard to manage. You cannot modify it without breaking code, right? So it's the cost of the mistake is higher by leaving something read write and trying to get it back to read only versus starting with read only and then realizing a mistake and then you make it right. Then that's very simple and cheap to do. All right. Um, always validating parameters. So every time you call a method that will modify state or actually just do something, you validate parameters because you never want uh, the object to be in an invalid state. Creating defensive copies, we'll have an example of that later, and minimize the use of getters and setters. When you add a getter and especially a setter, getters are not so bad, but even worse setters, you're just really breaking encapsulation. So you make a field private and then you add a setter. So you kind of end up just reversing that sort of encapsulation. Um, so try to avoid. So people say, yeah, but it's required by they'll say XYZ framework. It's required by Spring. It's required by JPA. No, it's not required by Spring or JPA. You can always uh, do field injection. All right. And then, of course, understand the real world entity. If you're creating a class called account, what does an account mean? What does what does an accounting mean? What does a bank account mean? If you're creating a class called transaction, what does transaction mean? So in accounting, transaction means all the debits and credits equal zero. Okay, so you're not just setting fields to certain values. All the fields have to uh, work together in some way. There's valid. You have to understand. If you understand the entity, you'll understand the valid values for the field. All right. So again, we will go back to understanding the business. We can't just be hacking away and writing code. We need to take more time to understand the business before we uh, write the code. Okay. Then let's talk about cohesion or information expert. Whoever has the information should do the work. All right. So when a class has the class that has the fields should be the one that does the work. What does that mean? It means that all this time that the majority of developers uh, are creating anemic classes that don't have any behavior, they just have fields and getters and setters, and then a matching class called the service, like a customer service, account service. Uh, what else? transaction service, employee service. That's absolutely wrong. The behavior should be in the class that has the fields. All right. Um, you shouldn't be separating it because that's not object-oriented programming anymore. Object-oriented programming is a combination of data structures and the functions and the behavior that acts on those data structures. So if you're separating the behavior and the field, that's the total opposite of object-oriented programming. And uh, it so every time you need some behavior done, you have to pull data from some anemic domain object, and then you have to do that. You have to expose all these fields, and you break encapsulation, and that introduces fragility. Right? So don't split data and behavior. If you're familiar with the law of the meter, that's your homework. Read on the law of the meter. Um, of course, domain models have disadvantages. Um, well, more of the disadvantage of uh, well, right when domain models have a disadvantage when you're reading large amounts of data. Normally, optimized SQL query will do a much better job than using some sort of ORM. All right. So avoid domain models if you're retrieving large amounts of data. So this is where CQRS comes in. Normally, we use domain models when we're writing because we need a lot of validation. But when we're reading, we don't need to use domain models. Normally, we just retrieve data in a tabular model, in a tabular way, or maybe we as some sort of map. All right. Question? Board? Papakain daw si Lauren. Any
Sir,
questions?
virtual.
Yeah. Lawrence will show you his merienda.
Wow, wala akong sir.
All right. No questions? No questions so far? Okay. So for the example, all right. So let me show you what our example is going to be. Uh, we are going to do, we are going to do, I'm going to do uh, university enlistment domain model. So that's my example, just a domain model. All right. Uh, very simple. So here's the requirements I plan to implement. Student is identified by his or her student number. Student enlists in one or more sections. Student is identified by a section ID. Student cannot enlist in the same section more than once. System makes sure the student cannot enlist in any section that has a conflict with previously enlisted sections. A section is in conflict with another section. The schedules are in conflict. Here's the schedules for this particular school. Each section has a room. Each section, I'm not sure if we have enough time, and I'm not allowed to use Java that time. Okay. All right, let me get started. Uh, let's start with the first bullet point. A student is identified by his or her student number, which is a non-negative uh, integer. All right. Uh, okay, so let me do some analysis on this. Okay, I chose university enlistment because everybody's done this, I suppose. All right, so everybody's familiar. Normally, we're working on a domain that might not be familiar to us, so um, then you need to uh, engage a domain expert. But in this case, it's a domain familiar with us. Uh, so I've been a student before, so I have some expertise here. A student is identified by a student number. All right. So, how do I implement this? maybe I can make student entity or a class in my domain. Okay, it's okay to make a guess. We can change it later. So let's start with that. All right. So I have my, let me create a class in my package. New class, and I make the class um, package private because I don't know if it should be public. So again, as private as possible. So I guess student should be my first entity. That's what it seems like. I can always change it later. So now I have a class called student. All right. And then what else can I do here? Notice I'm only working at one bullet point at a time. In fact, I'm just crawling through the phrases, the words and the phrases. And then there is an identifier. Uh, there's a student number. We need a way to hold the student number because that's the identifier. So maybe, and this is some sort of integer. So maybe I can make this, I can add a field, right? Private. It said it's an integer int ID, right? Because it's the ID. Is that correct? You can chat or you can just unmute yourself. You think that's correct? What do you think of this code? What's wrong with it if you don't think it's correct? Let me,
It's assigned int, should be unsigned.
okay, but yes, that's one. But also, uh, if if we're without going to this requirement, that's a non-negative integer. Uh, what else? What else do we need to? What else is wrong with it? So let's just work on this. Okay. Although we know it's an integer, we'll work on this half later. Any right? So it says here probably the name should be student number. All right. So it says here student is identified by his or her student number. So yes, our computer science profs would probably not mind that we call it ID, but as software engineers, we want to make the code close to the domain. So pick words. Let's pick words from our domain. So there's a term called student number. So we should use student number in our code. All right. That way, nobody has to ask, hey, what's an ID or what's a constraint or what's this thing here. Uh, they know that it represents the student number. So we also need to make it uh, non-negative, but we'll get to that. How about this? How do we make it the identifier? All right. Of course, uh, those that have a JPA background will say, or ORM background will say, oh, just put an at ID. Without doing that, uh, how do we tell? How do we represent in well, at least in Java? I'm sure there's a way to do it in all other programming languages. How do we say that uh, this value will tell you whether objects are the same or objects are not the same? All right, so it's the identifier. Very good. Uh, some of you replied, override the equals method. Very good. So, so let's do that. So we know this identifier. There was a time when, so there's only one option, but in other cases, there's other options. You just choose student number because the others are superfluous. There was a time when I was coding, we didn't have code generation for equals and hash code. We had to do it manually. Now I don't know how to do it manually anymore. Okay, so we're uh, we're done with this phrase. All right, let's go to this phrase, non-negative integer. All right, so let's do student int student. Um, how do we make it? How do we make sure it's always non-negative value, right? Right. Nice. So, thank you, Lil. So we write some validation, right? So if student number is less than zero, non-negative. So it says non-negative, so zero is valid. Then we throw new illegal argument exception, and then we say something like uh, student number may not be negative was, and then we add the value of the we add the value of the parameter so that when we're debugging, uh, just by looking at the log, we know what the errant value was. All right. Uh, very simple. All right. Um, okay, everything's still so simple. Nothing to refactor. Nothing to, we don't need to write tests yet. But now that we've fulfilled everything in this requirement, the next thing we should do is pause to see what else we can refactor. Okay, any suggestions on what we can refactor in this code? This very simple code? All right. Okay, let's do some refactoring. One, I said that in my slide earlier, um, I can't find here. Favor immutability, right? So let's favor immutability. Make this final, all right? You can always make it unfinal later, but of course, the student number should never change anyway. Uh, any Most of the time, if it's an ID, it should be final. I realize that some JPA frameworks like Eclipse Link don't like the final keyword, but Hibernate doesn't care. You can use final when you're using Hibernate. Um, what else can we do to refactor this code? Any suggestions? Well, one is there's always three methods when you're creating a domain class, not for every kind of class, but for a domain class, you should always override three methods. We already overrode two of those methods, hash code equals. The third that you should always override is to string. This provides a lot of conveniences, especially if you're embedding this value in an error message, an object in an error message. It can give you some information for debugging. So maybe we can just say return SN number. Uh, all right. That way we can identify the student just by calling the string. Okay. Uh, if no one else can figure out make the class final, um, yeah, Joshua Block recommended that make everything final, like even the class and things like that. But there's some issues there, especially if you're using Spring and Hibernate, because they need to do some proxying, and when you make a class final, that gets in the way of the operations of Spring and Hibernate's proxying. So um, so I just make the fields final. I don't make the class final. I hope that answers the question. All right. Uh, uh, okay. Um, let's move on to the next. Let's move on to the next requirement. Go back. Oops, there's a change request. Mobra. Nakita nyo na yung change request. So a student enlists in one or more sections. The student may have already enlisted in other sections. Okay. So what's my analysis here? You talk to your teammates, maybe make some drawings. Okay, I think there's another entity called section. All right. So after some discussion with your teammates, you create another class. Again, I don't make it private. I don't make it public unless later on, unless I realize I need to. So by default, I make it just package visible. I create my section class. All right. And then it says enlist in one or more sections. So there's a one-to-many relationship with uh, with student. All right. Maybe later we can optimize it if we find we can make it many to one. You'll see. But for now, let's just go with the way the requirement stated, one to many. All right. So private again by default final. Uh, collection of sections. Just call this section. And then it says the student may have already previously enlisted in other sections. So there has to be a way to instantiate a student. There must be a way to instantiate a student with uh, already some enlisted sections. Maybe the student started enlisting for a couple of sections, then he or she stopped, and then he or she resumed again. So they have to be able to resume from where they left off. So have another collection, section, sections. Okay. And then what's the straightforward way? The straightforward way to implement this would be this dot sections equals uh, section, right? So um, if the student has listed in sections already, so maybe retrieve from the database, We pass in a collection of sections that gets initialized here. Does that make sense? Or is there a problem there? Can anyone see the problem? Let's see if I, right. Right. So the problem here, what's the problem first? Some of you are jumping to the solution. But what do you see is the problem? Ah, yes, that's another problem. We have null. We should validate for null. If exception equals null, row new. Some would say illegal exception. Apache uses null pointer exception. So I'll use the Apache convention null pointer exception. All right. So uh, here, notice we're getting this field from uh, from outside, right? So we get the values of these fields from outside, but a collection is mutable. So say we pass in some sort of array list into this, right? And we set it here. The problem there is um, the when you pass it in, it doesn't. We don't know that if another thread or another operation will continue using that collection, right? We're not sure that the object is the only object that has access to the collection because it came from outside, right? So it could be another operation will continue to modify this collection and cause some unpredictable behavior in the student object. So we don't want that. We want to make sure that there's encapsulation. Only the student can modify uh, his or her collection, his or her field. All right. So one is we could create a defensive copy. All right. So we could well the solution is to make a defensive copy. So there's two ways we can make a defensive copy. One is we do new array list. So we create a new array list and then we this one creates a new array list and it copies over the content. That way, this collection will only contain this collection can only access by the student object by this student object. All right. So this collection, wherever it came from, we don't use that, and we don't care if another operation continues to modify it. Another way is here in the field, we already initialize this to some collection. Array. And then here, we just do a copy. All right. So either it's fine, but but you get the danger that we avoided. We avoided the danger of this collection, the field being exposed to modification by outside because this collection comes from elsewhere. All right? Gets nyo? Hirap naman. It's hard when there's no feedback. Anyway, I guess take getting used to online conferences. All right. All right. Let's see if there's anything else. Anything else to now that we've got that working again? Everything is no need to write tests. Nothing too complicated. Uh, Student enlists in one or more sections. The student. Okay. I think. Oh, we need a way for the student to actually enlist. Instead, here there's a they have to enlist. All right. So we'll say that enlisting, the act of enlisting is the act of adding to the section collection. Okay, that's how we'll implement it. So let's let's create a method called add section. All right. What do you think of this name? Add section. Is there a better name? Yeah, we should probably go back to the requirements or ask our business users what's the term they like to use. All right. So it already says here enlist. So maybe that's the term they like to use. All right. That way, when they say, hey, there's a problem, there's a problem with enlistment, nagkakaproblema sa enlistment. Even if you're the newest member of the team, you've never touched the code before, you do a find and look for the word enlist, and you'll probably run into the code causing the bug, right? So we'll use the term of the business, enlist. So now we finally, I think we finished it. Student list in one more section. All right, so we're done with this bullet point. Before moving on again, we refactor. What can we refactor? I probably want to add a check for null. Very repetitive, isn't it? We probably should look for a way to make this less repetitive. All right. Um, Anything else that you think we should refactor? Possible to, well, that's true, but that's not in this bullet point. So to avoid complexity, we're dealing with one small scenario or one small requirement at a time. All right. We add complexity in increments. We want to make sure we've got things working and we're doing things uh, we've done things in the most we take small steps, we get things to work, and we make sure we leave things clean before we move to another requirement. So the third requirement, no, actually the fourth requirement says a student cannot enlist in the same section more than once. So we'll get to that. But we're not going to do that yet because we're still working on other things. Any other? No need to say sorry. Shouldn't be enlist input a collection of sections. Again, that's not our requirement. We haven't run into that requirement where the student uh, well actually it says you're right, enlist in one or more sections, but the simplest way is just to have one method and then call it multiple times. If we run into a requirement where oh it's not enough, we need to make it a little more complex. Then we add another method that takes in a collection, and maybe that method will add multiple sections all at once. Of course, you'll have to validate. You'll also have to validate. So maybe it will iterate and call this method multiple times. But we don't want to jump the gun. Again, DPS, TTCTW, do the simplest thing that could possibly work. Um, don't uh, So your main role as a software engineer is to battle complexity. All right. So that's what separates you from being a programmer, just a programmer. Programmer will write code, hack away. But you call yourself a software engineer. If you're constantly trying to find the simplest way to do things, you're trying to battle complexity. All right, that's your main role as a software engineer. So if we don't need to, so yes, it's possible to add another method that will take in a collection of sections. But let's wait until our hand is forced when we realize, oh, we really have to do this. All right. For now, we'll leave it at this one method. All right. Let's see what else are the other questions. Okay. Okay. So let's go back to the requirements. A section is identified by its section ID, which is alphanumeric. All right. So we go back to section, we add a field. By now, we know that it should be private, final, string, and we should use the term in the that the business people use. So here, the business people call it section ID, so we'll use section ID in as our identifier. Okay, and then um, we learned earlier that if it's the identifier, we should use it for our hash code that equals. Source generate hash code that equals. All right. Notice even my constructors are just package uh, are just package visible. I don't make them public unless necessary. Uh, and let's add some validation. Simple validation first. Let's just check for null. Uh, if section ID equals null, row new null pointer exception section ID null. Okay. All right. So here we've got in the part where we've got section ID is the identifier, but now we do alpha. We have to make it alphanumeric. Seems simple enough, right? We just have to validate that there's no. We just have to validate that there's no characters that are um, non-alphanumeric, right? Um, so what's the best way? I don't know. We do. Maybe I should use a regex. Oh no, regex! I hate regex. I can never figure out what regex to do. I just have to rely on Stack Overflow, right? So now we encounter some complexity, right? So Mervin loves regex, but I hate regex. I have to turn to Stack Overflow uh, every time I do regex. Um, and even if you're very good in regex, you're confident that uh, your regex uh, is right. Remember, you need to make sure the people who will be maintaining it will also not uh, make any mistakes maintaining it. All right. So you can't expect that the next person maintaining your code is as good at regex as you. All right. Um, so looks like if you're going to use regex, you're going to have to document your regex with text. Oh, how many scenarios is that? There's a special character. There are spaces. Uh, there are all sorts of there are tabs. Oh no, there's so many scenarios. I'm getting lazy. All right. So if you're a little lazy, maybe that means that you have to go search for some other way. So laziness is a good thing for engineers, right? Laziness forces us, encourages us to look for simpler ways to do things, right? So writing the regex is simple enough, but documenting it with tests, there's just a lot of scenarios, and we can't leave this without tests because there's a little bit of complexity, right? Um, we we need to leave it with tests. And since we're too lazy to write tests, we'll find a different way to let's go find a different way to approach this. Okay. So what is the best way to do this? Can anybody guess? The best way to do this is to Google, right? So I keep telling the junior devs the difference between a junior dev and a senior dev is the junior dev will every time a junior dev gets a problem, he or she will write a lot of code. The senior dev will try to avoid writing code as much as possible and turn to Google to look for a ready-made solution or at least a solution that minimizes the amount of code, right? So let's turn to Google, um, Java library for alphanumeric, right? Blah, 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 alphanumeric, search, search, search. Eventually, I'll probably get to string utils of Apache Commons. Apache Commons string utils, okay? So this is a, a class um, with various operations for string manipulation, for string, uh, various operations in strings, including checking if a string is alphanumeric. All right, so has a method is alphanumeric. It's alphanumeric, right? So problem solved, right? So how do I add that? I go to Google again, Apache Commons Lang 3 Maven, and then I get the latest one, and then I copy, or maybe you're using Gradle or something else. And then, of course, I add it to my POM. Oops. All right, and now I'll use it in my code. Okay, so if string, if not string details dot uh, is alphanumeric. section ID must be alphanumeric was right. All right. And I think we've implemented everything here in the third bullet point. Again, I'm trying to do everything slowly, incrementally, a little bit of a time to make sure it's as simple as possible before moving on to the next. So now, again, after finishing this bullet point, I'll see where I can refactor. One thing that's starting to look ugly is that all our validations, it looks repetitive. Um, there is another class uh, in Apache Common Slang called validate for common validation. So, for example, here we can have validate. We can replace this with validate dot not null, not null or not blank. You can have not null, but in this case it's a string not blank. Not blank. Uh, Section ID, and then it's and then we can replace that. And then here we can replace this with validate that is true, string util, and then so now we can replace this. Okay. That's a bit easier to read. Notice I try to write my code as documentation. So uh, before thinking about how your computer or your compiler will read your code, think about how other people read your code. So take an effort to make your code as readable as possible. Um, Maybe I can make this so that this line is even shorter. Uh, Import status. Sorry, import status. I think this is a tad more impressive and readable. All right. So try to make your code, again, your priority is to make your code documentation. Uh, if there's a bug, if it's easy to read, it's easy to debug, so go for readability first. Uh, Prioritize readability. All right. So okay. Um, let's go to the next requirement. So here is where we have the requirement that says a student cannot enlist in the same section more than once. All right. Uh, so we go back to where enlistment happens. All right. So very convenient. It says it's an operation enlistment. So the first thing we look is the where it says enlist. So now we have to make sure a student cannot enlist in a section more than once. How can we do that? Any recommendation on how we avoid duplicate enlistment in section? Very good. Some recommendation. Yes. Okay. Good, good, good. Okay, some would suggest, oh, we have to loop through and then we have to make sure that it's not that the subsection doesn't exist in an array list. Again, uh, look for something that's already done for you. Don't try to come up with your own algorithm. The simplest way is to use the right collection that avoids um, duplicate. So as a few of you have mentioned, use some type of set. The simplest set is the hash set. So we replace it with hash set, and boom, we have already implemented this requirement. All right, so that's already worked. So next requirement, a system makes sure a student cannot list in any section that has a conflict with previously enlisted sections. What does that mean? Conflict. Section is in conflict with another section if the schedules are in conflict. Oh no, schedules. It's getting complicated. Schedules are as follows: days, periods. Okay, so looks like we've got some complexity here. All right, so we have to. Looks like it's time to finally write a test because uh, this looks a little bit complicated. All right. So let's write our test class. Okay. So let's review the. So here we are talking about section conflict. So um, it's a negative scenario. It should reject uh, sections that are in conflict. Now, the trouble so I could go and just start implementing the negative scenario and write a test for do TDD on the negative scenario. The problem I've encountered is sometimes when we jump to the negative scenario, um, at least what I've ended up doing is I finished implementing all the negative scenarios, and then all of a sudden I realized the positive scenario uh, was also blocked. I was failing. So what I always do is there's a negative scenario. I always have at least one positive scenario before I go into the negative scenario. So normally when you're doing a positive scenario, you're just testing. You're not doing TDD. It's already a behavior that might already exist because normally the positive scenario is so simple. So maybe you implemented it without test. So let's do the positive scenario. Uh, enlist two sections, no conflict. Notice when I write my test, I use underscores instead of camel case because it's all right for it to be long because I'm never gonna call it in. It's not a method that I call. Only JUnit calls it. So it's more important that it's readable because it serves as documentation for your teammates, especially your future teammates. Okay. Then, if you're a beginner in TDD, it helps to use Gherkin, given, when, then, given, when, then, to help guide you in designing your test. So, given uh, uh, two sections and a student, given a student and two sections with no conflict when both student and list in both, then both sections should be found in student and no other. All right. So let's create the student. Uh, student, student, student equals new student. Then two sections. And then the student enlists in both, right? Student dot enlist sec one. So no, remember, this is a TDD because the behavior already exists. We're just writing a test. We're just adding a test for an existing behavior. Pero hindi pa to, but this still is a TDD. Later, when we implement the negative scenario, that's when we're gonna do TDD. Then we make sure that the two sections are in the student. Okay. So how do we do that? How do we check? We'll need to add a getter because we need a way to retrieve the sections. All right. So we'll make the getter again non-public to um, to maintain some encapsulation. Okay. So collection section. Yes. Right. It's just section. Right. Back here we get the section. Or if you want to use Java, use version equals student get section get ah, get student get sections dapat uh, get and then um, we uh, assert that both sections are present and that only two sections, right? Okay. Ba't ayaw ng lista to? Tama, list of. List of Sec 1 and assert that there's only one cert equals, there's only two sections, two sections that size. No, wait. Hmm. Hmm. Forgot how to use a cert. Oh, anyway, I'll just do this old school. Okay. Hmm. All right. Okay. That's my problem. Okay. Parentheses. Cert. All right. Sorry about that. I couldn't find the parentheses. The missing parentheses. Okay. So I'll run the test. Again, this isn't TDDS. It's writing a test for existing behavior. Oh, it failed. Expected. True but false. Hmm. Add section. Oh, I was adding section. Enlist. Student object sections. Sections contain list of. Let me try old school. Hmm. Contains all. Sorry about that. All right. Sorry about that snag. I haven't done this. I haven't. I guess too much vacation time for me. Okay. Um. All right. So now we have a positive scenario. We have a positive test. We can finally do the negative scenario. All right. So what's the negative scenario? Ask, test, void, and list two sections. Same schedule. Okay. So according to our requirements, if they have the same schedule, then they should be in conflict. If we analyze the requirement, there's no chance for a section to have overlapping schedules. The only thing is either they have the same schedule or they have completely different schedules, right? Because the periods don't overlap. So so now let's again, if you're new to TDD, normally we add that's quite helpful. Given, when, then. So given student and two sections name kid when and okay. So now we're doing okay. We're doing TDG because we're now creating uh, behavior that doesn't exist yet. Okay, so we again have our before we do that, let's do some refactoring. So here we have student. Notice we have to call the student constructor even if the student has no what's this doesn't have any sections yet. So we can add them here. The the test shows us that we can improve the design by adding an extra constructor. Okay. So we let the test before that. Okay. So we can make our code easier to use by adding another constructor. Student number. This
May login pa ba sa Zoom niya? Hindi niya. I-click lang yung link.
login.
Login.
Hindi. Click the link and then enter the password.
Hindi siya nag-ano eh. Or hindi ba nag-open?
We can make this um, for initializing a student without any sections yet. It becomes easier to use. So here, let's copy this same code. Um, but now we have to add a schedule to the section. All right. So let's go back to section. We need to add a field called schedule, right? So private final something schedule. So what should a schedule be? Should be should it be a class by itself? Should it be just a string? What do you think? How do we how do we create a schedule?
Nag-speak ba?
All right. How do you think is the best way to create a schedule? Should we create a class or should we just make it a string? That's the simplest way. So if it's a string, we're going to need to parse the string to figure out what the schedule is, right? We need to parse the string. We need to check if there's any conflict. We need to check, oh, does this string mean Monday? Does this mean Thursday? Does this string mean 10 o'clock, 11:30, right? So it's actually quite complex if you use the string, and that it'll be a lot of work to document it with tests, right? So it's probably better if we create a class schedule. Right? So let's create a class called schedule. Okay. So we create a class called schedule, and then a schedule is made up of day and period, right? Days and a period. So it's private final blank days, private final blank period. So what do you think should be the type of days and the type of period? Should it be again, should they be strings again? Or should they be something else? Any suggestion? right? So if we go back to the requirements, notice that the days, there's only 3 days, okay? There's only 3 ways you can mix and match days. There's only Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Friday, and Wednesday, Saturday, right? There's only three of them, 3 options. And for the periods, there's only 6 options, okay? Um, Maybe we can check, hey, is there any chance there's special classes on just Wednesday or one day, and then after talking to all the domain experts, he said, no, this is the way it's been for the last 20 years. So you can assume that it's always going to be this way. So we pursue the simplest way, and uh, as uh, as Irvin and Lyndon suggested, let's just use enum, all right? Because uh, this is this is a good uh, scenario where we can just hard code the option. All right. So let's create enum for the day. Uh, Make it enum day uh, MTH Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Friday, Wednesday, and then enum period. Now, so period, you can, there's different ways to do this. What I like to do is I just use H to stand for hour, and then I use the beginning of the beginning time of each. Okay, so 0830. You can just do it period one, period two, period three. That works also. P1, P2, P3. There's other ways to do it. This is my preference. Right. So now let's finish the schedule. Schedule, day, period, with that day equals day, with that period equals period. Let's validate that not null, day, cannot be null, validate not null, period cannot be null. All right. And then hash will equal obviously both. You can't say one schedule is equal to another unless you're using both. And then override string. Return base plus. I forgot to create the two. So let I forgot to create the two string for section. Let's add a field to the parameter to the constructor for the schedule. All right. Over. So now let's go back to the test. Let's implement. Let's now add. Uh, so these ones here should have differing schedules. New schedule. The one. All right. So they have different schedules, and then here in the other one, they'll have the same schedule. Right. So here, they'll have the same schedule, so that there's going to be a conflict. All right. So now they have the same schedule. We do enlistment. Uh, Student.enlist step one. Student.enlist step two. Then we assert throws. Assert throws. Uh, expected type would be, for now, let's do runtime exception, and then we'll improve it later on. Let's just say exception, and we'll improve it later on. And then um, that actually in the second enlistment, there should already be an exception thrown. All right. So now to do TDD, the test, and then we watch the test fail. So let's watch the test fail. Yeah. So TDD yan, that's the right thing. It's supposed to be fail. Expected exception to be thrown, but nothing was thrown. So now we have to get it to throw an exception. All right. If there is a schedule conflict. So now let's go back to our enlistment. Oh, I forgot. There's something that needs to be refactored from the first. Sorry. Let's go back to the first test. All right. So here in the first test, we call get sections. Um, Here in get sections, what do you think needs to be? What's the problem that needs to be fixed here? Can anybody see the problem? I missed this. It's my fault. Uh, what do you think is the problem with this method? Can anybody see the problem? Yes. Thank you, Lil. So the collection, all collections, well, in this case, yes, we're using a mutable collection. It has to be mutable because we're adding sections to this collection, right? Every index. But at the same time, here we're exposing it, right? So if you call get section, if an operation calls get section, that operation can modify the contents of the collection. And then again, you can subject the the object to an invalid state again. So this is dangerous. So how do we resolve this? How do we resolve this? Right. Very good, Mervin. We again do a defensive copy. Yes, it can. We can. The copy can be an unmodifiable collection. But me, I just make an ordinary collection because um, uh, once you make a copy, it once you make a copy, for me, I don't care anymore what the operation will do with the collection. So I just do new array list. Uh, some would return an unmodifiable list, which is fine as well. Me, I prefer to just return a array list. So now I copy over the contents of this collection here, the collection that belongs to the student, and then I create a new collection and I copy over the contents. And that's what I give to the other operations, the callers. So that those callers can do whatever they want to the collection that they receive. My internal collection in the object is unaffected. So um, we go back to what do you call this, defensive copy, right? Sorry for that distraction. Let's go back to implementing the uh, avoidance of schedule conflict. So let's loop through um, the sections to check for schedule conflict. Sections, um, sections that uh, uh, um, for each uh, section. If per section, if the current section, if we get the schedule of wala pang, there's still no getter for the schedule. So let's add a getter to the schedule for section. Okay. Um, again, notice I don't make it public unless I find the need to. Most of the time, these methods will only be needed within the domain model. So All right. Um, so let's see this that these lines solve our scenario. Okay, it passed. So again, once you get it passing, we need to refactor. So refactoring is something we do frequently. After we get something to work, we refactor right away. So where can we refactor? So one of the things I see that needs to be refactored is I find it a little bit confusing to know which section this is. So I'll just rename this the new section. So I know which one is the current section and which one is the new section. All right. What else? Any suggestions on what else we can refactor? Any other suggestions on what we can refactor? Convert exception, runtime descriptive. We call this some sort of something more descriptive to the domain because the behavior here is it isn't just oh alphanumeric or is null. It's a behavior. The validation is something specific to the domain. So we should probably create our own exception. Let's call it schedule conflict exception maybe. Let's say new class. Let's call it schedule conflict exception. Uh, superclass is runtime exception. And then create, let's inherit the constructors from the superclass. And then here in the test, let's make it expect schedule conflict exception. And then schedule conflict exception. And then here in the student, we replace runtime exception. We don't have to, we don't need to have that sentence anymore because we know it's a schedule conflict. So let's see if everything still passes or everything still passes. So the advantage here is one, when you're looking through the logs, you don't see a lot of, it's hard to figure if it's all runtime exception or illegal argument. It's easier to sift through the logs when you're trying to find out what's wrong. If it's a schedule conflict, then it's easy to find. Then you just do a find on schedule conflict. Also, another is you can handle different things programmatically. Maybe for illegal argument, you just write to logs. But when it's schedule conflict, you show a message to the user. So you handle it differently. It's easier to handle the different exceptions differently when there are different types of exceptions. You can handle them programmatically. All right. So what else? Is there anything else that we can refactor here? So good recommendations, guys. Uh, what else do you think we can um, right? Clue, it has something to do with cohesion. How can we make our code more cohesive? How can we implement um, the information expert pattern? Whoever has the information should do the work. In this case, here, for this code, who has the information? Which class has the information being used by this code? section. So we should move the behavior to the section class. All right. So let's see how we can move the behavior to the section class. So maybe one simple way would be to simply have a method that returns true or false if there's a conflict, as conflict. All right. So let's see if our code improves. Um, let's see if our code improves. All right. So there's a little bit of improvement. I think it's more readable, right? It's more expressive compared to this one earlier, right? You don't first glance, especially if you're new to the project, you're not exactly sure what this does. You're just seeing that there's a check for equality and schedules. But with this, we know that you're checking for conflict. Schedules, having the same schedule means there's a conflict. But maybe what we can do, we can improve it further. We can move more behavior, even even more behavior by including um, even the throwing of uh, the exception. So maybe every time we see that they have the same schedule or conflicting schedules, you'll always throw an exception. So how about instead of just checking for conflict in the section class, we have something like this. Um, void validate validate conflict, or it's shorter, check conflict. Check conflict section. If this is, if there's a conflict, then so now we can have per section dot check conflict with new section. All right. So now I think this is a little bit more descriptive. Okay. It says that, okay, before we add the new section, we have to check first if this new section has a conflict with the current section. So it's a little bit more expressive than the previous block. And we end up spreading the code around, right? We have a lot of simple code, simple behavior spread throughout the domain class, as opposed to having some classes with almost no behavior and some classes with long, complex routines. All right, so um, simplicity again leads to less bugs, right? So this is very simple, and this is also still very simple. All right. Um, any questions so far? Okay. So let's run the test to make sure we didn't break anything. And also, we can get rid of this getter. All right. So this getter, nobody's calling it, not doing much harm, but Again, less code uh, is always more robust, less fragile. All right. So if any of you ever take one of my classes, I teach a 5-day course on agile engineering. Um, so this I use the same example but longer, and of course part of it I let you guys do on your own. And I also introduce what do you call this? Change requests along the way to see if you're able to accommodate change. All right. Um, so that's if I keep going, it'll take us forever. So I'll end here. Did you guys learn anything? Type nyo na lang. What did you learn? What's the what's the most salient thing you learned today? Ano yung tumatak sa isip nyo? What did you learn? What's one thing that you learned today? What's the most salient thing? Domain modeling, test for complexity. Start writing tests the moment you see complexity. All right. Make it simple. Don't start with a test. I wouldn't say don't start with a test when you see complexity. First of all, try to find the first goal is to write simple code. And then when you can't write it anymore, when you have to write complex code, that's when you turn to test. But your first option is to try to write simple code. All right, all right. Good, good, good. Yes, do the simplest thing possible. Thank you. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Is this very different from how you do your code now? Any questions? You can just you can either write your question or you can unmute and ask me the question.
Hi, sir. This is Mervin.
Hello,
Yep.
I'm Mervin.
So just in connection with because you already mentioned the domain-driven design pioneered
Yep,
by I think it's Eric Evans. Yeah.
very good.
So like in practice, how do you come up with because in the book he discussed in length how he always wants a model to be always evolving, like
Right,
make
of course.
always room for flexibility. So like in so far in the clients that you've met or the projects that you've dealt with, how
Mhm.
does it translate in real life? I mean, can you give like a
How
short example or
how does it translate in real life? That is where projects are a disadvantage versus just maintaining a team to maintain a product. Because when projects, after you deliver, you get paid. There's no incentive to make it maintainable anymore.
Mm,
So it
okay?
becomes the problem of the next team, right? Whereas opposed to
Yes.
your a more agile relationship where it's time and material, you have a team dedicated for an indefinite period of time. There's more incentive because you know you're going to be maintaining that code. So basically, if you um, I'm not so sure if I appreciate if I understand the question properly. Pero um, when we see that there's a need to change, then we just change the main model. What problems are you encountering specifically? Baka I can answer
And
that.
specifically, sir, like for example, I'm not sure if you come to a point wherein you sit with the domain expert and then
Mm.
like just what like Eric did in the book, like he made some simple drawings first, and then
Mm. Yes,
the
yes, yes.
the drawings kind of evolved. I mean, I'm just curious with the projects or with the clients that you've dealt with so far. How does it? I mean, where do you store the documents? Like, is there even if
Ah,
you're into
storage.
agile? Yeah. Do you need to
Ah,
store the UML class, the UML
UML.
diagrams?
Most of our clients aren't don't really require the UML classes. So if ever internal to the team, there's just drawings on whiteboard that they
Okay.
photograph if
Okay.
they need to do if they need more persistent documentation. So
Okay.
the main team is uh, sometimes using complex UML tools, the cost of maintenance of those complex drawings
That's
uh,
right.
discourages you
Yes.
from adopting, right? That's
Yes.
why
Yes.
another guy, I think it was Scott Ambler, another author, advocates that um, if you're gonna do UML, your tool should just be whiteboards and scratch
Okay.
paper or even
Makes
napkins
sense.
because that will
Yes.
discourage you from from treating the UML diagrams as sacred, and you
Yes.
make changes as you need it, not fearing breaking
Yeah.
the diagram.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you. And to your point, that makes, I mean, if you treat your code as your documentation, just like you emphasized earlier, then I think that just makes everybody's life easier.
Right, right. Yeah. Thanks for the
Thank
bite.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Other questions? Okay, if there's no other questions, I guess that's it. I'll turn the con back to Lauren. Lawrence, tulog ka na ba? I think I put him to sleep.
Hindi naman, sir. Sobrang informative
Okay,
lang
Lawrence.
at
Lawrence is
at
still awake. I hope you learned something,
grabe
Lawrence.
naman.
You learned to code.
Yes, sir. Nag-flashback sa programming language na class ko before.
Okay,
Kaso
okay,
CE at Python. Pero
okay.
yun,
Great, great, great.
I hope everyone learned something from the oh, marami pa po pala sir question sa chat. Wait
Oh,
lang,
there's additional
basahin natin.
question. Oh, sige.
Opo,
Oh, yeah, you can scroll, no? Sorry, sorry. Is
okay, okay.
there any
Sige, balik ko.
way,
Okay.
sorry, I didn't see this. Is there any convenient way to converting story acceptance criteria to data modeling? Is there any convenient way to convert story acceptance criteria to data modeling? Well, I wouldn't say there's a formula. It's just like, I don't know if you had the same experience in school where, well, back then it was entity, it, you were creating ERDs and we were just picking from, um, nouns and verbs from the document. It's the same thing. Um, and as similar to the previous question, your initial model that you draw, don't take too much. It's not doesn't have to be this scientific document. There's no science to it. It's just a way to communicate. Your diagrams, your models are a way for you to communicate with each other and to communicate with your business stakeholder. All right. If you put more effort than you need to derive communication, then you're putting too much effort. So the models are there for communication. So don't. Uh, that's the amount. Once it serves its purpose for communication, that's okay na yun. That's already a good model. Is it possible to test private methods? No, it's not possible to test private methods. Um, if your private methods are quite normally a private method is called by a less private method anyway, so that's the one you test, right? Um, so so you test the method that calls the private method. What else? To make simple, okay. I have the impression that TDD is only good if the dev already has at least a modular. Yes, yes. TDD is, again, as I keep bringing to the point, appreciation of the business and the requirements is what makes you a software engineer, not just a programmer. Okay, you're there to create value. You're there, a programmer or computer scientist. A computer scientist is there to come up with algorithms, right? A software engineer is there to create economic value for an organization. So if you don't understand what brings economic value to an organization, you're not a software engineer. All right. So um, so the TDD, yes, you can't do TDD. In fact, in extreme programming, they say that you should never start on a requirement unless you understand unless you fully understand the requirements and why those requirements bring value to the organization. Someone's muting me. I don't know why. Uh, um, does it mean detailed? Does it mean detailed design, for example, is necessary before doing TDD? Is detailed design? Of course, there's always design. TDD is actually a design approach. You use tests to be able to see your code from the point of view of another programmer who will be using it. All right. So like before, earlier, I saw that I ano, my constructor is a little inconvenient because I'm always required to use two parameters. So I need to create another constructor that only needs one parameter. All right. So TDD is a form of design. Uh, um, and notice my design approach is incremental. So I just work with one scenario, then another, then another. Yes, I'll end up encountering scenarios that will make me have to go back and change a lot of the previous scenarios. But that's okay. At least every step of the way, I'm keeping my code simple and working. Okay, so TDD is, yes, it's a form of detailed design, but it's not upfront design. It's what we're avoiding is, yes, we do some upfront design, but not, it doesn't have to be too detailed. All right. The TDD approach will make your design evolve. Um, use Power Max to force. I can't say if that was a mistake. Maybe you had your reason. Again, if I wasn't there, I don't want to judge. But normally, you just test the method that calls the private method. Or I don't know if it was too much effort to use. What the question I keep asking is, what value did you derive from doing that exercise? If you didn't create value, didn't produce risk, maybe the effort wasn't worth it. All right. If there's more questions, feel free to ask. We still have a bit of time. Lawrence, I think there's no more questions.
Yes, sir. I think there's no more questions now. So, on behalf of the PSIA Secretariat and PSIA, we'd like to thank everyone who attended. I will send a feedback form by email to everyone who attended. Also, sir, I have to ask, would you be able to send the deck that was used so that we
Sure,
can
sure. I'll
send
send
it?
the deck. I'll send the
Okay.
PDF version of
So,
the deck.
yes, sir. So we'll send out as well the PDF version of the deck that was used to everyone. So thank you. Good day, and also stay safe. Ingat tayo. Extended nga pala yung quarantine up to April 30. So stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.